Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another video for you. The Cut Content series continues. Today we're continuing to explore the 0.5.3 alpha, which was the first version of the game made available to players for testing. So starting off with some stuff I missed from the previous episode, when I was showing off Old Stormwind, I mentioned that right outside of the stockades there was this canal blocking off that little section outside the mage quarter, but I neglected to go into the actual dungeon itself. Stockades is the smallest dungeon in the game, but in the alpha it's even smaller because it's missing an entire wing. The western wing, which held a Dextran ward, is gone completely, and he's moved over right next to Basil Thread in the eastern wing. And another thing, when I was showing off all of the weird hunter abilities, I forgot to mention that some of them actually required reagents to cast. Fire Shot needed something called Fire Tar. Starburst, which was the flare, required an explosive shell, as did Explosive Shot. You could also only use this ability with a gun, and for Frost Shot you needed a Frost Vial. You could just buy all of these reagents from a vendor, but pretty interesting to note that along with the ammo requirement and the eventual pet happiness and loyalty systems, hunters had a lot of maintenance going on, which I imagine would be the reason for the removal of these abilities and the reagents to cast them. But nonetheless, it's pretty interesting. Almost as interesting as the premier backend development learning tool, BootDodev. BootDodev isn't like them other coding platforms. They've cracked the code on how to make learning backend development not just effective, but also fun. They've designed the entire experience like an RPG game where you're not just passively watching tutorials, but you're actively completing quests, earning XP, leveling up, and even taking on boss fights. I've worked with them in the past because, considering the subject matter, I think it resonates really well with you guys. It's very RPG-like, and you can learn Python and Go while feeling like you're actually playing an RPG. I used to have a background in computer science myself, and I have actually been using it as more of just a hobby, and I'm really enjoying it so far. It feels like a new way to learn without the boredom that usually comes with these online courses. It gets you writing a ton of code because that's really the only way you can learn. Plus you have a very supportive Discord community and even an AI-powered bear wizard named Boots who will guide you through any tricky concepts. If you're apprehensive, they do offer a 30-day no questions asked refund policy, so if it's not for you, no worries. Plus you can also demo every course for free to see if it clicks with your learning style. I would say that if you have been on the fence about doing something like this would be a really good way to kind of get your feet wet to see if it would be something that is for you. If you would like to try it, click the link in the description and use my code MadSeasonShow to get 25% off your first payment, whether it's for 1 month or an entire year. But anyways, back to the video. Next up we have what I teased in the last episode, and that's the original island of Grender in the Western Plaguelands. This used to be a fortress in the Kingdom of Lordaeron, and it was invaded by the Horde during the Second War, and it was destroyed and eventually restored where the Barov family took up residence. They eventually allied with Kel'Thuzad and became a hideout of the Cult of the Damned, where they taught followers the forbidden art of necromancy, and of course was known to the players as Scholomance. So as you may know, this is where you could find the entrance to the dungeon. And the first difference you'll notice here is that there is no bridge connecting the island to the mainland, forcing a swim. And once you enter, you'll find a couple of destroyed buildings strewn about and a dark portal entrance. Wait, what? Well, if you watched episode 1 of this series, you would know that they just used this for a placeholder for dungeon entrances at the time. And obviously this would eventually become Scholomance. And in case you were wondering, it is inactive at this point, and nothing happens when you try to zone through it. But there's actually a bit of history going on with this dungeon. It originally wasn't even going to be an instance. One of the things that the game hyped up on its release were micro dungeons, which were essentially those large cave systems spread throughout the game. For example, the cave atop the altar of Jintha Alor in the Hinterlands is a micro dungeon. So although it's pretty standard today, it was apparently a pretty big feature back then to have these cave systems, and Scholomance was going to be one such micro dungeon, but the developers had made it big enough to warrant an evolution into an actual instance dungeon. So what you're seeing right here is actually the second version of Scholomance. Next, while we're in the area, it's also worth covering Anderhal. This was once a prosperous city in northern Lordaeron. similar to Hearthglen or Stratholme, and it ended up being one of the casualties of the Scourge outbreak that destroyed the land, with a lich known as Araj the Summoner eventually using it as a base of operations to spread corruption across the land via those plague cauldrons that you might remember if you ever quested here. In the alpha, the town is bigger and also more intact. There are now walls surrounding the city, making it harder to navigate. And if you remember the 1.0 release, most of the buildings were completely blown apart, leaving only the foundation. In this version, they're still relatively intact. And if you're curious, Araj the Summoner is in his usual spot, although he has that Blood Mage model instead of the Lich. And as for Chromie, she's not yet added in this version, and her building is completely empty. Next, moving on to a system, we have professions, which function pretty differently. As you know, in Released, you could have 2 primary professions and all 3 secondaries, but in the alpha, it was a little less restrictive. First is there were no primary nor secondary professions, and the way it worked was that every level you gained a skill point, and then you could spend these skill points to train any profession that you want. Apprentice cost 1, Journeyman cost 3, Expert 5, Master 10, unless it's fishing, cooking, or first aid, which have reduced costs. As an aside, first aid also had a straight up heal, a 5-second cast on a 1-minute cooldown, which is pretty crazy. But back to professions, that was it. That was the only restriction, meaning that if you wanted to, you could learn Journeyman of everything and be sort of this jack of all trades and master of none. Just to throw in our complimentary Star Wars Galaxies mention in my World of Warcraft video, it is actually pretty similar to the class system in that game, where you're given a certain amount of skill points and you then distribute those between a variety of professions of your choice, and you could create these weird hybrid builds. I would even go as far to say that this alpha system may have even been inspired directly by SWG. But a lot more freedom regardless, and it's pretty interesting, I thought. In a previous episode, we talked about the different forms of player housing that existed. The first being where you could initially just place them in the world, to the abandoned housing district in Stormwind, and eventually garrisons in Draenor. And I just wanted to show you the first in action here because I missed it last time. This is what it would have looked like had it made it into the game. And you can probably tell the issue already, as it would just block people off from critical quest mobs, and this entire zone would just be littered with houses. You wouldn't even be able to move. So, it's an interesting idea. The player housing debate still rages on to this day, but these are the origins if you were curious. You may have spied earlier when talking about professions that languages are also considered a skill. The undead race was actually pretty unique because they would be the only race who could communicate cross-faction. Of course, as you would imagine, once being a human, they'd retain the common language, so they had this unique flair to them where it was eventually changed due to Blizzard wanting to maintain a barrier between the 2 factions in the game. Actually, if you really want to know something crazy, in its very early years, there weren't even going to be factions, period. Orcs and humans and trolls and dwarves and so on would all be able to play with each other, which is kind of interesting because today, as far as I know with retail, since the Alliance are so vastly outnumbered because I quit the game and they lost their hero, the players have sort of been calling for an end of factions. As far as I know, Blizzard has sort of met them halfway by allowing them to raid together. And there's some other cross-faction elements such as the mercenary mode for PvP when the queues are imbalanced. But honestly, you guys probably know more about retail than I do at this point. And also, since we just mentioned undead, another interesting thing is that they were actually considered the undead type initially, meaning that they would be immune to fear, but they would be susceptible to shackle or exorcism or turn undead. But this was later changed for balance reasons. But next, in the last episode, as I said, we went over the hunter and how different they were. So I wanted to do the same here with mages because they actually have some interesting stuff going on. First is we have Khadgar's unlocking, which would function similarly to the rogue's lockpick. They eventually removed this because they felt that rogues were a little too plain in that they were just straight damage dealers. So they wanted them to have a bit of unique flair by removing this from mages. On the same vein, we also have invisibility, which they eventually saw added back to the game after vanilla. But they did have it in this alpha, which would of course allow them to be able to stealth, which is just crazy considering how powerful they already were. During the alpha testing of the game, there's this undead mage who would trick low-level Alliance by yelling in gutter speak to come to the bridge away from the guards in Red Ridge for free gold, at which point he would cook up a pyroblast while invisible and one-shot him. Maybe that's why they removed both invisibility and cross-faction communication. Some developer got butt-blasted by this guy, and he coded it out of the game in a fit of rage. Water Elemental, most players know, was a Burning Crusade edition, but mages did already have it in the alpha in the Frost Magic tree. It has a 3-minute cooldown, it lasts for a minute, but it doesn't seem to have that AoE root that it eventually got. And something I want to point out here as well is that pretty much all of these classes, mage included, are still very barebone, only holding a handful of spells per school. Remember, there's no talent system right now, so what you're looking at is their entire toolkit, so they definitely came a long way by the time release came. Next, we have a model change. So this actually made it to 1.0, and it was changed pretty early on in the game, but ogres were originally a little bit more tubby. They got more of a dad bod here, and I personally remember when this change went in, I was grinding on the ogre mound in Duskwood on my warrior, and I logged out there for the night, and the next day I logged into this model change, and it looked like they all hit the gym overnight. I happen to prefer the old model actually, but that might also be because I think that everything that is old is superior to everything that is new, because I am a depressed classic World of Warcraft player. Moving on, another environment difference here is in Loch Modan, with the Stonerot Dam. It's much larger than the 1.0 version, but also more barren. Side note here, I always like to take feedback with everything. There are probably hundreds of these more kind of minor differences like this. For example, here's that infamous Yeti cave in Hillsbrad where you always died on PvP servers. As you can see, it used to be that smaller version. But my question is, do you guys want to see the more minor stuff like this in future episodes? Or should I just stick to the big stuff like Alpha Ironforge, for instance, in comparison? So yeah, let me know in the comments because I can do either. Speaking of which though, I guess for this video I'll just keep doing this little stuff for now. But Booty Bay looked a little bit different. At this point the boat system was still in the works, so you'll notice that the ships are permanently docked here. Of course, in release, to travel between the two continents, players would have to wait for the actual physical boat or zeppelin to sail in, and then wait for it to cross over. This all wasn't finished yet, so for now, you just had these Boatmaster NPCs breaking kayfabe by saying, hey, be patient, we're still working on this crap, but for now you can just teleport if you want. If you're curious what the other ones looked like, here's Ratchet, which also looks pretty different, and one of these NPCs became quite popular. There's Captain Placeholder, who resides in Menethil, and as for the docks, as you'll see, they're much smaller. Here's what Darkshore looked like. And as for Theramore, it actually has 2 docks. One goes to Menethil, and the other goes nowhere, as there's no Boatmaster. So some sort of abandoned plans here for something. Maybe it was to go to Uldum or something, or one of those abandoned islands that we talked about in previous episodes. But you may be asking yourself that, if the boats aren't working, how do you get back and forth between Darnassus and Darkshore? Well, the answer to that is, like in release, it's by bird, but here it's the only option. In 1.0, you had that teleport that went to Ruthrin Village, where you could go either by boat or hippogriff, but in the alpha that's yet to be added, both the boat system and Ruthrin Village as a whole, and in the place of the teleport is just a platform with a flight master. But that about covers it for this episode. Thanks for letting me be your tour guide here today. I'm actually really enjoying this series, so expect a lot more secret/exploration stuff. There's a lot more to talk about, I assure you. This will be a pretty long-going series, so if you enjoyed it, make sure you check back soon for more. And aside from that, like the video if you liked it, because I will most certainly see you in the next one. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video.